Welcome to the Motivated Martial Arts Podcast. Your hosts, Jackson White and Gavin Cook, have been friends and Taekwondo training partners for over 40 years. This podcast will bring you a mixture of their life stories, martial arts, and business experiences to motivate you in life and throughout your martial arts journey. Adding in a mixture of inspiring interviews and some of the best traditional martial artists around today. So over to your hosts, the Motivated Martial Artists.
And welcome to the Motivated Martial Artists Podcast with me, Gavin Cook.
And me, Jackson White.
And today we're super excited. We've got a guest calling us all the way from St. Petersburg, Florida. We've got John Graden coming through via a Zoom link today. So John has got a really, really interesting history in martial arts. He's been around a long, long time and done loads and loads of different stuff. You know, he's a podcaster, he's an author, he's a motivator, he's a speaker, he's a karate expert. He's the founder of NAPMA, which is the National Association of Professional Martial Arts over in the US, and we're super excited to have John on the show today. So I'd like to welcome you on the show today, John.
Great to be here. Thanks, guys.
No, it's a pleasure, and like I say, thanks for calling in. Like I say, I know we're all sort of stuck at home with the COVID-19 pandemic at the moment, but it's got its plus points because it gives us all time to talk on podcasts. So
always seek to turn a negative into a positive.
Exactly. Was it the Zig Ziglar said, always turn a lemon into a lemonade?
I'm sure.
Okay then, John, we'll kick off. So a question we always ask all of our guests. So for a lot of our listeners here in the UK, they may not know you. So can you give us a bit about your background, your childhood, growing up, and how you actually got into martial arts?
I'm an Army brat. I was born in Fort Hood, Texas in 1960, and then we moved from Fort Hood, Texas to Munich, Germany. It was a military base, Army base. My dad was a sergeant in the Army. He was a logistics sergeant. And my brothers were born in Munich, and then we moved to Fort Knox, Kentucky when I was probably 4. And I used to watch the Batman TV series with my dad. He liked comic books as a kid. It was a method of escape for him because he grew up in a kind of impoverished, unpleasant childhood. So we watched Batman together, and then the Green Hornet show debuted, and I was just mesmerized that the smallest guy on the screen got all of the respect. And that, of course, was Kato, played by Bruce Lee. I had no idea who Bruce Lee was, but I knew I wanted what he had. And that was every episode, we all waited until he kicked somebody over a railing because the show was kind of bad anyway. So then we moved to Florida, and it was here in Florida that I regained my interest in martial arts, and I started calling around. Most of the schools that I called were kind of abrupt and gruff, but one guy talked to me at length. I asked him, actually, what is this thing called Kata? Because in the yellow pages, he was the United States Kata champion. He goes, no, it's called Kata. It's an imaginary fight scene against multiple opponents. I said, oh, wow, that sounds really cool. So he invited me to come in and watch the class, and my dad and my brothers and all, we went to watch the class, and I was just blown away. There was this kid, and I was 14. This 16-year-old blue belt walked out. There was a pole in the middle of the school, a support pole that was wrapped in padding, and I now know, hit it with a back leg round kick, and the whole building shook. I just thought, holy cow, I've got to have this. So the instructor came over and he said, it's $25 a month and there's a year contract. And my parents said, no way, you quit football. We're not going to sign a contract. So that was pretty much done until I got a phone call about 6 weeks later from the wife of the owner. The owner was Walt Bone. The wife was Debbie Bone. And she said, and this is a follow-up call. This is really important. I'm calling to see if you're still interested in training with us. And I said, oh, I'd love to, but my parents won't pay for it because of the contract. She said, you sound really interested. Tell you what, you can come by after school tomorrow and clean the dojo for your lessons. I was the original wax on, wax off kid. And I started actually that in December of 1973. I did it for 8 weeks before the new wipeout class started, because in those days they would get 30 guys signed up first and then start the wipeout class. So I knew from that first class I was going to do this for the rest of my life. It was instantaneous. So here I am.
Okay, so that was 1973 then, John. Year before I was born.
First class was February 12th, 1974. But again, because in those days you didn't go through a trial lesson program. They would wait until they get 20 to 30 people signed up for the class and then start them all together. And what was beautiful is that because I had to go clean the school every day, it put me in the company of my instructor, Hank Farrer. He was the owner of that particular location. There were 3 locations. So after a while, about the time I made green belt, he took me on as his personal training partner. Then he would come by my house in a very cool Spitfire sports car, pick me up and take me to the karate school and then beat on me for a little bit as his training partner. So I was living the life. But here's what's interesting. I was a straight A student when I joined karate. I went from being a straight A student to being a straight F student and then dropping out of high school. And I attribute all of that to the martial arts.
That's interesting, because that's certainly not what we tell our parents these days, is it?
No, that's the truth. But it is the truth. No doubt about it.
So I think I can probably guess why, but can you just explain to the audience why that was, do you think?
The school that I grew up in was a highly acclaimed school with really good instructors. In those days, our exposure to the martial arts world was through magazines like Black Belt and Inside of Official Karate magazine. So, I would really dive into these magazines and look through them. And my instructors were in there on a regular basis. If nothing else, they were rated as a fighter. So I really, in my mind, they became the biggest influence in my life, which is really bad for a teenager, because they were doing drugs, they were selling drugs, they were doing illegal activities, and the attitude was very anti-society. So that there was an underlying rebellion in the life skills that were being taught there. And they weren't being taught necessarily directly like we deliver our life skill today. It was more through their actions and their attitudes. And eventually my instructor, Walt Bone, died in a plane crash smuggling pot into Texas. And that's all, that story is in my book, Who Killed Walt Bone, which is getting lots of attention. In fact, I got a call last week from Hollywood, a director of documentaries, just finished the book, loved it, and wants to come out and see me about doing something with the Who Killed Walt Bone book. So that's kind of cool.
Watch this space. That could be interesting.
Yeah. So that was there wasn't the most important lesson that we were taught in this karate school in that young, impressionable age was to be honest. My instructors, super honest. They were always really good about that. They did not value money. You almost had to have a connection just to pay tuition. And to train really hard. And that was a real big, that one stuck with me to this day. Really value a healthy lifestyle. So that was important. Those are the 2 good lessons that I received from these guys, but there was a lot of other craziness going on. So I wouldn't trade it for the world, because it was the best school for me, and it really launched a foundation for me to do what I've done through the years. But it's definitely not your typical, I joined a martial arts school and it changed my life for the better story. It's a little more mixed up than that.
Okay, that's interesting. So what you mentioned the training. When did you get involved in the competing side, the competition side of the martial art?
I was terrified of everything. I had no confidence at all. My father was not a teacher. He was a screamer. You'd go from silence to violence very quickly in my household. So it's an intimidating kind of atmosphere. It leaves you feeling like you have no control. And then you join a karate school, and then you can see a direct line to gain control and to gain respect. And that's like light to a moth. So in that scenario, I was really drawn to the arts in a deep, deep way. I used to spend the night at the school, sometimes to avoid my home life. And I would stay there, because in those days, when you became a blue belt, they gave you a key to the front door, You can imagine what kind of craziness was going on in that school at 3:00 in the morning on a Saturday night. But it was real different from those. And then regarding competition, I was training every day with my instructor, so I got to be really good really fast because I trained like a crazy kid. My mother used to yell at me because in the shopping store, I would go down the aisles doing round kicks, and doing my kicks all the way down the aisle. And I was practicing constantly. So we had a little inter-school tournament, and I won. I was shocked. I couldn't believe it, but I won the event. And then my instructor was very tournament-oriented. Of course, it was point karate and kata. And I actually excelled more in kata than I did point karate, but I just kind of followed in his footsteps. So virtually as a teenager, every weekend was either a volleyball tournament, beach volleyball, which we played with our instructor, Walt Bone, my brother Jim and I, or we'd be at a karate tournament. So it was a fun life. It was a lot of fun. And there was always parties after the tournaments.
Sorry, John, I say it's quite interesting because it sounds quite similar to myself and Jackson's early teenage life. We were, obviously got into the martial arts when we were Jackson was, I think, 3 or 4 years old.
4 years old, yeah.
4 years old, and I was 8. But our teenage years basically spent traveling around to competitions every weekend. And if it wasn't a competition, we were practicing at home, or we was, watching kung fu movies like Enter the Dragon. And it's funny, isn't it? How so many,
Van Damme.
Yeah, this is funny how so many sort of childhoods sound the same when involved when you're so obsessed with the martial arts, and how it molds you as a teenager.
Two things. Quick comments on that. My father, when we were in Fort Hood, Kentucky, he was called into the military office and told he was going to be restationed to another place. He had a choice: Huntsville, Alabama, or Tampa Bay, Florida. And I just wonder, had he chosen Huntsville, Alabama, that's where I would have been raised. And what a completely different lifeline I would have had. Sure. And it's mind-blowing to me sometimes. I think about that one little decision. And the reason they chose Florida is because there are more people who played the card game Bridge in Florida than they thought there would be in Huntsville, Alabama. You got to be kidding me. I was at one of my conventions. I had 2,000 school owners at one of my conventions here in Florida. And he told me that story. The reason I were here is because I just chose because more bridge players lived here. My jaw just dropped. I couldn't believe that. I'm sitting there looking at this big event, all the lives that have been affected by this organization, and it was all based upon bridge craziness. The second part is on the way to my first wipeout class, he had stopped to get gas, and I convinced him to buy the copy of Professional Karate magazine that was on the shelf. And I knew nothing about anybody in there except on the back cover, there was an Adonis, blonde hair, muscular guy flying through the air with what I know now is a flying sidekick. And it was a picture of Joe Louis. And I thought, wow, this is a real superhero. I couldn't believe it. And then fast forward 2 years or so, my instructor, Walt Bone's wife left him because of all the drug smuggling and all of that. So Joe Louis moved in with him as his friend for 6 months. So this guy, Joe Louis, that I saw on the cover, is now teaching our classes, and we're interacting with him. And then he went off to do his Hollywood thing in the later 70s. And then he moved back to the area in 1984 and took me on as his personal training partner. So really the opportunity to train with Joe Louis 2-3 times a week when he was in town was unbelievable. That's truly like, getting guitar lessons from Jimi Hendrix.
Yes, it's a dream, isn't it?
Unbelievable.
Absolute dream. I mean, did he? Could you share any of his legendary stories? He must have some great stories from obviously working with Bruce and stuff like that. Anything you could share from our audience?
Yeah, sure. There's a bunch of them. First off, when he did his first thing I did, because Mike Anderson lived in the area as well. Mike Anderson created Professional Karate Magazine and the Professional Karate Association, which was the first full contact association, and the World Championships were on ABC, the big American network, and it was a special, and it was a big hit. And he went into the offices to talk about doing it again, and they said, this is not a real sport. You handpicked the fighters, Joe Louis, Bill Wallace, Jeff Smith. And so that was killed. He sold it off for $1. But Joe Louis moved in with him, and Mike asked me to host a seminar to make some money for Joe. So I did a seminar, promoted it, had 80 people show up. I handed Joe Louis $2,000 and told him, "You talk too much when you teach." He looked at me and said, "No one has ever critiqued my teaching before." I said, "Well, if I'm going to charge people a different price to participate, they need to participate, not just watch. They're not paying twice as much to get an active ticket as opposed to a spectator ticket, just so they can get closer to you to listen to you babble on." And he was stunned. And I think I earned his respect that day. Then I also asked him if we could start to spar. He goes, "I don't do that point stuff. I only do full contact." I said, "Well, I trust you." And then fast forward to 1993, Black Belt Magazine does a cover story on Joe Louis stating that when he dies, he is passing the torch to myself and my brother Jim. And that was a cover story. Pretty dang cool. So it's all these little things, these little fantasies of that young teenager or child in Kentucky came true and surpassed. Unbelievable.
Okay. So what during your martial arts time? So you said you pretty much flunked out of high school. When did you start getting yourself back aligned into high school education and back into the business world?
In the States, they have something called a GED, a General Education Diploma. It's kind of like the equivalent of getting your high school diploma. I knew that I was going to teach karate. The way I thought about it at the time, I always knew that. There was no question about it. I knew my career was set from that first moment I stepped into school. So I saw high school as just being interfering with that process. So instead of going to the school, I would get up, walk out the door in the morning, but instead of going to high school, I went to the karate school. And so I just started training like that. And actually it was Joe Louis who convinced me to open a school in about 1986. I used to teach at a college here. So I had college age students, and that was fun because they would sign up each semester in their mind for 2 hours twice a week. And if they dropped out, it didn't matter. I get paid the same. So I killed them. Class started with a mile run. So, but Joe Louis would meet me at the college and we'd spar. And then he would meet me at a Jewish community center that I taught at, and we'd spar. And we'd meet at a basketball place where we sparred. Finally, he says, "John, you've got to give your students a home, a place they could take pride in." I knew nothing about business, but I knew about home. And I know how much I cherished the karate school that I grew up in. So I instantly started looking for a location. So it's interesting how his influence intertwined both on the martial arts side and also on the business side.
Okay, so you said on that sort of statement then that you didn't know anything about business, but you knew about home. So what do you think? What was the catalyst for you to really maybe start pushing? Because obviously you're obviously a very accomplished businessman now. What do you think it was that sort of took you down that path to sort of I suppose hone your skills as a businessman?
There are so many instances, Gavin, that are just little things. And here's the little thing that changed everything for me. I opened my school and I ran it just like Walt Bone did. I mean, business was not really the focus, but I had a big following already. So I had because I had the college class, and also I filled the classes up pretty quickly, but business was not the focus. Then one day, Joe Louis walks in and he sets a set of cassette tapes. You might remember cassette tapes.
Yeah, remember them.
It was called "How to Negotiate" by a guy with a lovely British accent named Roger Dawson, I think was his name.
Okay.
And I listened to it and I was blown away. The guy taught me how to negotiate. And I started to realize that one of the things that martial arts does teach us is that there is a technique for everything. So I turned my car into a four-wheeled university, and I just started to devour Brian Tracy, Zig Ziglar, all those guys. And I learned how to sell. I learned how to build a good business. I learned the importance of customer or student service. So that, interesting enough, that one little thing, he set those tapes on my desk. He said, do you want this? I think it's boring. And I said, yeah, sure.
You know what, John, that really resonates with me, because I, before obviously becoming a full-time martial arts instructor and really getting involved, I was sort of a young a young salesman years ago for a lift company, and I went out.
Decent, it was actually, sorry, decent job, John, but it was a little bit up and down.
Yeah.
I always got to get that gag in when he mentions his lift sales stories.
Haven't heard that one yet.
But I used to, I used to love Zig Ziglar, and I went and bought. Again, it was on cassette tape, and I used to have it in my car, and it was closing techniques. I'm sure it was a closing techniques one. You know, and Zig Ziglar was the master at closing sales, wasn't he? And you know, and I used to listen to it before I used to go into a meeting. I used to sit there in the car, listen to. I think, right, I'm going to use that closing technique today in this meeting, and I was determined to try to somehow shoehorn that technique into the meetings that I'll go to. And sometimes, you know, you'd fall totally on your face, and other times certain elements of it will work. But bit by bit, you're building up that resistance, and you're building up that skill set over time, aren't you? In all the things that you do.
I use the analogy that you start as a white belt and everything, you know, and then you get your green belt, your brown belt, eventually you become a black belt at it. And when you're a black belt at whatever it is you're doing, you're doing pretty well. Brian Tracy was my particular favorite, and he actually, I found out he really was deeply involved in the martial arts. He credits a lot of his internal fortitude to the training that he received. He actually ran a school for a while. So eventually he became part of my board of advisors, and he wrote the foreword to a couple of my books, including The Imposter Syndrome.
Yeah, Eat That Frog. Eat That Frog. Was that one of Brian Tracy's?
Yep. Yeah. And he is also, he's a part of my Mata certification board. So it's been great. Again, one of those things where you're remotely involved. You see Joe Louis on the back cover of a magazine. I'm listening to Brian Tracy. But this wonderful path, this wonderful life I've had in the martial arts has put me in the company of these guys in a big way. So I'm really very grateful for that. Same as Tony Robbins. He was a guest on my TV show for 5 different episodes. And all of those are back on my podcast. The Truth About the Martial Arts Business podcast has interviews with Brian Tracy and Tony Robbins and a bunch of others.
Wow. I mean, there's certainly some big names that you've got in your network there, John. And it's funny because myself and Jackie have this conversation all the time, is that we always try and surround ourselves with individuals that think the same as us. You know what I mean? That they try to, they're sort of forward thinkers. They're always looking for opportunities. And I think if you surround yourself with people like that, I mean, certainly some of the greats that you're talking about, you know, it's no wonder that you've managed to sort of propel yourself forward in your business life when you're surrounded by individuals like that.
Well, it's interesting when you are young and cocky and your ego is running your life, you're full of pride, and you take pride in being the smartest guy in the room. And then you grow up and you realize the last guy you want to be is the smartest guy in the room, because you want to surround yourself with people that are smarter than you. And that takes maturity. And one day I'll get it.
I think as well, it's also about the ability to realize about self-development. You mentioned reading, listening to your cassette tapes, and certainly Gavin and I now, we are, reading. It's just not Gavin and I at all. We're awful readers. But if you stick an audio book in front of us, a set of headphones, then we're full throttle, and it's just about making sure that you're continuously self-developing yourself. And at the moment, Gavin and I, probably for the last 5 years, I think we've probably read 95% of the Audible application back history of self-development books, business books, and looking at and driving through to deliver self-development to yourself is key. And that, I think that's part of the maturity. And then when you are on that path, then and meeting others that are also on that path, again, it drives you to the next level. And I think that's key in anybody's life, is that the ability to want to self-improve.
I have a hunger for knowledge. I always have, and I am an avid reader. I also listen to a ton of audiobooks as well. When I'm listening to the radio, back in the 80s, I made this decision. Why would I listen to the radio and make the radio station money when I can listen to something that's going to make me money? Mm-hmm. So my car was the Rolling University for years.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a business development executive at the moment, and I probably do about 8 hours a day in my car. And if I'm not on a informative podcast, I'm on the next generation. I've just done a degree in cybersecurity, and that was all done on audiobooks and YouTube. The learning side. So it's I would say my car is also a rolling university, without a doubt.
Yes, it sounds like it.
What advice would you give to some of the youngsters that are listening to this sort of podcast then, John? Because I know myself and Jackie, we sort of seem to be banging our heads against a brick wall sometimes, trying to get some of our students and some of our friends who are not maybe on the same path as us to listen to self-development and try to really, get them to educate themselves. But sometimes it's a path that, we really try, but we feel like we're not going to get through to them. What sort of advice would you give to people that have never listened to audio or never even read books, self-development?
Yeah, I have a friend who said he hasn't read a book. Actually, I think it's something like 70% of adults do not read a complete book until once they graduate high school, they never read another book again. And which is surprising because everything that I read constantly, both fiction and nonfiction. But the key, I think, attention spans are getting shorter. And as martial arts teachers, we have to constantly and consistently evaluate and reevaluate what we are doing, what we are teaching. And it's really important, and this is hard for guys to do, to separate your emotions from the evaluation. Because most martial artists that are doing this professionally, this is what they do, grew up in a similar situation to how I grew up. Again, a sense of being out of control, intimidated, somewhat bullied, you're around violence. So when you join a martial arts school, you have a direct path to getting out of that situation. And in fact, by the time you're a brown belt, people are calling you mister. And by the time you're a black belt, they're calling you master and bowing to you. And that's just like light for a moth. So that becomes highly addicting. And the downside is, it's really great that martial arts does that for us, and it did a wonderful job for me. The downside is that we keep such a strong emotional connection to the style that we were taught. And the truth is, the style made no difference at all. If you would have joined a Wing Chun school, a Kempo school, or a Taekwondo school, provided the instructors were all on the same inspiring level, you would have fallen in love with whatever style was being taught. Because every instructor says their style is the best. And as that very young, impressionable kid, I believed it. My instructor said that we do Taekwondo. The leg is a much longer and stronger weapon than the arm, so we can kick somebody, hit them harder before they can reach us with their arms. I bought in completely, hook, line, and sinker, 15 years old. And then over time, I started to realize this is a lot of this stuff makes no sense. And I was the first center judge for the WACO, the World Association of Kickboxing Organizations. The first time they had a kata competition, I was the center ref. I loved kata. I have more trophies in kata than I do anything else, but I would never teach that stuff. I think I'm robbing people of their time by teaching kata. If somebody really wants to learn kata, that's like a very specific skill set, like Russian ballet, I would do that. But most of the people who walk through a martial arts school are not seeking kata, yet that's what we feed them because that's what we were raised with. And all these traditional blocks where you've got to fold the arms and chamber and then turn the hips and then you step towards your opponent and do a block and then freeze. And then you aim your punch. Who the heck aims a punch? Steps forward and punches and pulls the hand back to the hip with your groin squared right at the opponent. So most of what I see in traditional martial arts is really nonsensical. And I replaced all that with more practical skills and techniques that are much easier to learn, much easier to teach, and actually work. They make sense. So I love kata. I mean, that was my gig for so long. I was the champion, 1984 U.S. Open champion. I mean, I was in there. But I would today, you have to eliminate the emotions. You have to detach yourself from what your particular passion is about martial arts, and then decide what are the real benefits that I want my students to have. Well, I want them to have confidence. That confidence is built on competence. I want them to have a prepared mental attitude, not a positive mental attitude. And there's a big difference. A prepared mental attitude. I want them to value their lifestyle, what their healthy. I want them to value a healthy lifestyle. I want them to train, exercise on a regular basis, and take responsibility for what they're putting in their mouth. I want them to be able to defend themselves. Now, I really feel that I owe thousands of students refunds for the classes that I taught under the pretext of teaching self-defense, because it wasn't. It was absolute garbage. And it wasn't until a police officer who was training with me asked me to put together a curriculum so he could share with his cadets. And he laughed at it. He said, "This is so unrealistic. I could never show this." And I was embarrassed, but that was the first inkling that traditional martial arts is theory. It's not reality. Mm-hmm. And then fast forward years and years and years, I was watching my kids in a karate class, and the owner of the school walked out and taught a 10-minute segment on anti-abduction. And my jaw dropped. I turned to my wife and said, "That is the best self-defense instruction I've ever heard. I could not have taught 1 minute of that." And we enrolled into that program, and I learned in a 10-week program with Cobra Defense taught by Chris Sutton right here in Clearwater, Florida. I learned more in 10 weeks than I did in the previous 40 years of training on the highest levels. So what you may think is really valuable to the world about the martial arts you do probably isn't. It's valuable to you. So that's why a constant reevaluation has to be done from an unbiased perspective. That's really important. Often we hear maybe a wife has a suggestion about your class, and you go, "What? How dare you tell me what to do?" But I'm a fifth-degree black belt, and she's always right. You know, her suggestion's right because she's not looking at the school through your eyes. You have black belt eyes. These are the eyes of a trained professional. She's looking at the school through market eyes, the eyes of a mother, the eyes of a woman, the eyes that are looking out for kids. So it's a completely different perspective. And if you're not doing that, and particularly right now during this virus where guys have more time on their hands than they need or they want, now's a real good time to evaluate your curriculum. And I just put a video up on the martialartsteachers.com site on the blog that explains how to evaluate your curriculum.
Okay, that sounds interesting. It's something that Gavin and I, I think we're well subscribed to what you're talking about. Because certainly in the UK, from what we've seen in our time working with instructors in the US and doing our podcast, certainly the US martial arts fraternity are probably 10 years ahead of the martial arts fraternity in terms of how their evolution. And we still see within the UK a lot of traditionalists, that are very, very traditional, mm-hmm. and I would say, scared to step outside and evaluate themselves. And then once they've evaluated themselves, a lot of I would say that they go even further to say they're petrified of changing that.
And they'll be the first one to say about the importance of the Kaizen attitude, constant, mm-hmm. never-ending improvement, except when it comes to what I teach.
Yeah.
And this is, I mean, like we said to you before, obviously myself and Jackie came over to St. Petersburg in January to meet up with Melody, who I know you know very well. Obviously, we can get onto that story in a minute. And that was really because we could see, certainly look at the UK market. There was a lot of people teaching children the way that they were taught as instructors back 20 years ago. This is a bit like what you were saying earlier on. This was the way I was taught. This is the correct way to do it. This is traditional. This is what I'm going to teach. So basically, all they do is just teach what they're basically little mini-me's of their own instructor, right? At the mm-hmm. end of the day, and they're just teaching the way they think that it should be taught. But things evolve and things change. So we, I was using Melody's skills program in my schools, and we looked. I'd say I sort of went to Jackson and said, this is a great program, and no one's really using this sort of approach. Well, not many schools are using this sort of approach in the UK. So like you say, myself and Jackie are very, very much bought into that because, some of the philosophies you guys have need to be brought over to the UK a bit more? Because, like Jackie said,
in 1993. Well, first off, I had a TV show here locally that was really helpful for bringing people into the school. I wish somebody would have coached me on how to be a better host, because I look at those videos and cringe. But I eventually had 2 schools. I had 600 students. I trained world champions. I'd been named to the WACO team. I've been all tours all through Europe, and I always knew there was more in me than that. And then that's when I came up with the idea of a professional association for martial arts school owners. And this was called NAPMA, National Association of Professional Martial Arts. I created that after writing my book, Black Belt Management, in 1993. So that became a massive hit. And there were thousands of members of NAPMA. And then I created the Martial Arts Professional magazine, because I knew that NAPMA was a $99 a month program. Not everybody's going to get that. But if I send them a magazine for free, they'll start to learn, and it'll improve their business. And I was sending 26,000 copies out a month. And later that year, 1996, 97, I created the American Council on Martial Arts. This was the ACMA. And what I did was I recruited 25 experts in things like sports psychology, motivation, child psychology, physiology. Brian Tracy was one of them. And they all contributed a chapter to the manual and the overall course. And the requirement was not only are they already experts in this field, but they're black belts. So that was a huge hit. In the United States, there's a place called the Cooper Institute of Aerobics in Dallas, Texas, founded by Dr. Kenneth Cooper, who coined the word aerobics. He is the doctor to the Bush family and many presidents. And they contacted us, and they administered that program through their organization for years. That was a real big compliment. Joe Lewis completed it. Bill Wallace completed it. June Reed completed it. They all went to Dallas and took the class. It's universal teaching principles that are not based on style. And when I sold the organization in 2003, amidst a vicious, nasty lawsuit, I created the Martial Arts Teachers Association, and have since remodeled that certification program as the Martial Arts Teachers Association Instructor Certification Program. And that is a big hit, and that's also on the martialartsteachers.com website. So that's been really good. And so it's not style based. It's all about it's science. It's how do you speak to a 7-year-old versus how do you speak to a 13-year-old. Mm-hmm. That's not style specific. That's just learning how to be a good teacher, because the vast majority of people who are teaching martial arts have never had a class on how to teach.
Well, I mean, do you know what? You're absolutely right, and we see that all the time within the UK. There is people know how to teach a pattern, but there is no method of instruction.
No, it's exactly right. And it's not their fault. I mean,
of course not. No.
Their instructors didn't know either, and it's just one of those things that. The only way to improve that is not through regulation, because regulation is always bad, or at least mostly bad, but through self-policing and internal education. And that's what the MATA certification program is. It's been a real big success in that regard, because, the truth is that you can come out of college and university with an MBA and open a martial arts school, and you can come out of prison and open a martial arts school. They're both happening all the time. So there's got to be some kind of internal education program, and we're real proud of the MATA certification program.
Okay, that sounds good. So moving forward slightly, then, you obviously you've authored a number of books. Just talk us through the challenges that you've had when you've been writing your books, and to get those books published. What have been your aspirations for them?
I have written books on every possible platform, from self-publishing to Simon & Schuster in New York. My first book was Black Belt Management, a guide to achieving success without selling out. It was a massive hit because guys knew me as a fighter. They knew me as a protege of Joe Lewis. They didn't know that I ran really successful schools and I was a good teacher. So so that helped to break down the barriers. I also toured the United States around that same time to teach seminars to martial arts school owners, and they would often come into the seminar arms crossed and resistant to change. It's almost like an immediate challenge. And I worked on persuasion techniques. One of the things that worked very well is I would explain to them that in order to write this book, I had to visit a lot of different schools. I'd visited Kempo schools and Taekwondo schools. I even visited a ninjutsu school. We couldn't see them, but we would. That line right away, that line instantly told the crowd that I'm one of them. It was an insider joke, and that broke down the barriers, and it was a massive success. So the Black Belt management, here's something you can't do today, I don't think. But I made a choice. I had a choice. In the book publishing world, you could have it's called a perfect bound book. That's the book that's kind of got the glue and the binding is there. So it's a squared off kind of binding on it. Or you could print it on notebook paper with 3 ring. So I printed it out as a notebook paper on notebook paper and put it into a 3 ring manual. So now, because it was a manual, I could charge $149 for it. Had I left it at perfect bound, I would have been lucky to get $20 for it. So I sold like $2,000 at $149, paid off my first house. So just by putting it into a ringer, a notebook, made all the difference in the world. That was followed with the how to open and succeed in martial arts, something, how to open and operate a successful martial arts school. And then in 2003, after the lawsuits, the Truth About the Martial Arts Business, which is that book really resonated with a lot of people because the first section talks a lot about the psychology of martial arts. And then I went mainstream with the imposter syndrome, and that the imposter syndrome is the feeling that you're not as smart or talented as everyone else thinks you are, and you're about to be found out. So I wrote that book. Brian Tracy wrote the foreword. And then I did a video on YouTube on how to develop self-confidence. The next morning, I get in the car. My wife is driving me to the airport. And I say, baby, listen to this. And this guy says, I just watched your video. You're an excellent speaker. People need to hear what you say. I'm a good friend of Dr. Oz. I can get you on his show. 6 months later, we were in New York City on the Dr. Oz show. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, definitely.
I love that. I love the thing we said about the imposter syndrome, because I think there's so many people that struggle with that idea, that concept. As no doubt you put in your book, I'll have to read it. I've made a note. I've just made a note now to make sure I download it. But
interesting you mentioned that, because I had an interview a couple months ago with the BBC in Ireland about the imposter syndrome, because Michelle Obama had written an article on the imposter syndrome. She said in an interview how that really nags her. And the interview was going really good until I said, the only thing that Michelle Obama's done is she married a guy who became president. So yeah, if she's worried about her lack of accomplishments, that's a pretty good worry, because there's nothing there. She just hit the jackpot with her husband. That interview ended right there.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Mr. Gray. Goodbye. So,
but I mean, I'll be honest. It's something that I sort of struggled with a little bit when we started the podcast, because myself and Jackson, we've sort of been in the martial arts industry for coming up for nearly 40 years each. Obviously, we're both sort of met in the late 70s, early 80s. And obviously we've got our clubs and we're involved, and we've been fighters and stuff like that. But obviously we started the podcast, and we started it initially just as a little bit of fun, but then all of a sudden we started to have instructors reaching out to us, and we was getting people emailing us, writing to us saying, we listened to your podcast, we loved it, can we have some advice on this? And all of a sudden, you're starting to reach, I don't know, it's maybe a sort of a different level maybe. And you feel a bit out of your comfort, where you feel totally out of your comfort zone, but then you start to get this imposter syndrome of thinking, well, I don't deserve to be in this position. People are asking me things, and why are they asking us these questions? We're on the same, we're only the same as them, and it takes a bit of time to sort of for it to sink in sometimes. And I think you get to a point where you come out the other side of it a lot stronger with a lot more confidence.
Yeah, it is reprogramming your mind. I have over 100 hours of NLP, neuro-linguistic programming training. And it's to me, absolutely fascinating. Martial arts a martial arts class is in many ways a hypnosis session. It's NLP. NLP is really physical hypnosis. People go into trance states. It's really interesting to me. It revealed a lot. So when it comes to the imposter syndrome, it is learning also to say thank you. That was really hard for me for a long time. If I won a tournament, people would say, "Hey, that's great. Congratulations." I would say, "Oh, well, the guys, they weren't that good today. You know, the competition wasn't that hard." So, but in time, eventually you start to recognize when you're recognized. I mean, I think a big moment for me personally was when the Wall Street Journal did a cover story on me changing the martial arts industry. I mean, I couldn't have dreamed of a better recognition. I mean, that was unbelievable back in, I think, 1999. And then Joe Louis nominated me for the Martial Arts Hall of Fame in Burbank. But the politics were stronger than the qualification. So that never happened. But just the fact that he would write something like that for me, it's like that Black Book cover story where he said that, you know, we're the proteges, passing the torch to us. It's almost dreamlike. I mean, it is almost dreamlike. And for me right now, I am ready to take on the world. I'm really enjoying my podcast. It feels like that's a great fit for me. This is kind of the stuff I've been doing. And I've really spent the last 20 years somewhat isolated. And I believe that, you know, solitude is a gift from God, but isolation is a self-imposed prison sometimes. So it's nice to be back out. And I appreciate you having me on this podcast today.
No, it's cool. It's cool to have you on, and we're all isolated at the moment, aren't we? And it's a weird time.
Indeed, yep. And our leadership position again is that turn a negative into positive. We've got to work on the front line. So, I've been posting a lot of tips for guys that they're teaching online, what to do, what not to do, and that's also at martialartsteachers.com in the blog. There's a video that outlines some common mistakes guys are making that can be very helpful. So if you're going online, be sure and check that video out first.
Yeah, good stuff. So we're going to wrap up in a minute, I think, John. Something that we always ask our guests is, knowing what you know today, what advice would you give to a younger self?
I think we covered it a little bit earlier. Do not be the smartest guy in the room. And I wouldn't trade a moment, but I like to trade blows with a couple of guys, one in Orlando in particular. But beyond that, I've had a blessed career. I knew from my first moment I was going to do this forever, and 40-some years later, I'm on your podcast, so it's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, I think and it's funny because since we've started doing this podcast, you know, we've met such interesting, diverse martial artists, and it certainly sort of lit a fire within me, I suppose, and Jackson, you know, to continue doing what we're doing and keep going for the greater good, because what we do as martial arts instructors is a great thing, right? At the end of the day.
Yeah. When you put yourself out there like you guys are, you have to really raise your barrier. You got to really raise the ceiling of performance, because you're attracting eyes to you and they're watching, and you may be surprised, but martial arts can be occasionally judgmental, just like human beings.
Oh yeah, we've experienced a bit of that, but you know what?
A bit of that.
I think, you know, as I always say to Gavin, we've got to maintain our thick skin sometimes. You can please some of the people some of the time. I think, you know, that's a saying I live by. Mm-hmm. You can please some of them some of the time. We may not be everybody's cup of tea, but you know what? We're doing it for what we feel is a good reason and a good cause. So
sure seems like it,
and that's what we're invested in, really.
Yeah, and it's being, I know the word is thrown around a lot these days, but I suppose to a degree we're trying to be a bit disruptive to the industry, because I think every industry needs to be disrupted sometimes, you know, for the good, obviously. You know, I think you need to keep putting yourself out your comfort zone, and people need to keep growing. Because
let me address that just real quickly as we're wrapping things up. I'm going to remind the audience that my disruption is to stop doing kata. Stop pulling your hands back to your hips. Stop doing front stance and that silly horse stance. You want to work your legs, do squats. But think about it. The first half of class, you tell the students to square off to the opponent, put your hand on your hip, get your chin up, put your hand back to your hip and hold that, aim that punch.
And then wonder why they get beaten up when they're sparring.
They start to spar, and you say, well, put your hands up, move around more. It's all contradiction. So I created a program called Empower Kickboxing that teaches this curriculum. It is really popular. It is really easy to teach, and you can have virtually every rank in the same class. It's not a fitness kickboxing class. It's a martial arts class, but it adapts this new modern type curriculum that I've been kind of touting through our conversation here. I think it's so important that people evaluate their curriculum, throw the traditional stuff out. Doesn't mean you can't have respect. I mean, I don't have to wear a white gi to have respect. I mean, one of the main benefits you want to teach your students, of course, is to be respectful and to be a good person. That's really important. You can always do that. It doesn't require pulling horse stance punching to be respectful. Just because it's different doesn't mean it's disrespectful. So a tradition is what you're raised with. It doesn't mean that it's going to be the right thing always. So there you go. That's my disruptive.
And like everything, it's evolution, isn't it? When you look at an example of Taekwondo, that was evolved from a Japanese martial art. And people have followed it religiously for many, many years.
But don't you dare change it.
Yeah, but why not? Because it came from a change.
Yeah, so, absolutely. I mean, what did Funakoshi do? He took karate from Okinawa and he changed it to make it appeal to the Japanese masses. Mm-hmm. Oh, that must be commercial. Funakoshi's commercial? Holy cow, that can't be. Bruce Lee, use what is useful and discard the rest. Joe Louis, all those guys. I mean, like 3 years for black belt. Why? Mm-hmm. Joe Louis made 2 black belts in 7 months. Bill Wallace made his in 9. Mike Stone made his in 13. Why? And the instructors couldn't speak English very well. So you're telling me it takes as long to earn a black belt as it does to go through West Point and graduate? I don't think so. I mean, that's just whacked out. So there you go. Disruption.
Yeah, disruption all the way. Well, listen, John, we are well, as long as the coronavirus sorts itself out, we're hoping to back over to St. Petersburg at the end of the year. So it'd be great if we could maybe meet up.
I will see if I can pencil you in.
That'd be much appreciated, sir. Thank you very much.
I look forward to it, guys. Thanks so much.
All right,
John, it's been a pleasure. John. Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your listening platform. It would be awesome if you could also leave us a review. We really appreciate your valued feedback.
Also, check out our website, themotivatedmartialartist.com. We also have a YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook page and Facebook group. All the links are available on the show notes below.
We'd like to thank again our show sponsors, skillsconnect.co.uk, the world's leading children's development program for martial arts. If you're a martial arts school owner or instructor and are looking for some inspiration, ideas or drills for your children's classes, make sure you check the skills out.